Good evening all and welcome back to Nature Week. Tonight we have a collection of camping stories, which I sincerely hope you enjoy. Don't forget to come back every day this week for even more stories, camping, nature and cryptids. But for now it's time to get comfortable. Grab your tents and let the darkness take control. A buddy of mine and I try to camp twice a month now that I have a vehicle that can be trusted to get me to some sort of more remote areas of our state. We planned a camping trip for this past weekend. We chose a fairly remote location we had been to the previous weekend. The previous weekend we were the only people we'd seen within a 1 mile of our camping spot. Friday night rolls around. We got there and set up. This story takes place on the Saturday night. It's around 9 p.m, so the sun is long gone and the moon hadn't quite risen yet. It's pitch black out there, and other than what our fire lit up, there was no visibility. Suddenly, we hear a man screaming. We listen intently, silently, sharing an anxious look. At first, we were hoping it was some drunk having a little too much fun, but it quickly becomes obvious this isn't fun party screaming. It isn't even like he's hurt. It sounds like he's full of despair, anger, and anguish. I'm going to take a moment to remind you that it's 9 p.m, pitch black night, in the middle of nowhere in the woods, 5 miles from the nearest cell phone signal. We hadn't seen anyone in hours. The screaming continues for what feels like hours, but was probably about 5 solid minutes. We had no idea what to make of it. I started feeling extremely paranoid. We gathered up anything remotely close to a weapon and tried to come up with an explanation of the screaming while keeping our eyes on the forest around us. After about 15 tense minutes of fear-induced paranoia, I nearly fell out of my seat as I watched a flashlight and lantern slowly enter our camp. I greeted the stranger with a basic, "How's it going?" before he was even lit up by the fire. He responded quickly but flatly by asking if we could do him a favor. "That depends on the favor," my buddy and I said in unison. Obviously tense, holding our weapons near to us, the stranger proceeded to ask if he could hang out for a second by the fire. Given the 2 of us and 1 of him, plus our myriad of weapons gathered around from our camp within arm's reach, we decided to agree and allow him to hang. After a short second of awkward silence, I ask him what the hell's going on, and he proceeds to tell me and my buddy that he was camping down the trail with a buddy of his own, and that his buddy had snapped and attempted to kill him. "Wait, what?" I said, before the thought even finished processing in my mind. "Is that the screaming we heard earlier?" The man nods slowly, staring blankly into the fire, and begins with his story. "We're just hanging out, man. We came up earlier today and my buddy just freaked out. He started screaming and screaming and wouldn't stop. Then he attacked me. He lunged at me. And I told him to just back off and chill, you know. Well, he kept coming after me. And it started getting pretty violent and I was pretty sure he was going to kill me. So I grabbed my car keys, the lights, and ran. I don't know what to do, man. He chased me when I ran, and I don't know what to do. We don't have firearms or anything, but we do have a hatchet." My buddy and I looked at each other for a second, completely astonished. Then something horrible dawned on me. "Wait, he chased you? Like, he's on his way here right now?" The man just slowly nods in a reply. And right on cue, like from some terrible horror movie coming to life, we hear screaming 30 to 40 feet from our camp down the main trail. "I just want your balance, Gary. Give me your balance, Gary. Gary, where are you?" I'd never heard a man scream like this in all my life. I'd never heard anything like it in my life. It was a brutal, guttural scream that was shrill to the ears, yet deep in pitch. The sound of someone gone completely mad, and the way he said the stranger's name could switch erratically from long and sing-song to short, guttural punches of sound. We killed our lights, became silent, and listened. By some miracle, the madman didn't notice our camp and continued walking down the trail, screaming the whole way. We ended up chatting for, Gary, for hours, listening to the screaming getting further and further. We come to find out they had taken about 5 grams of magic mushrooms each, and his buddy Ty was a co-worker of his, and was fine for 3.5 hours, then suddenly snapped. It seemed as though Ty thought he could kill Gary and steal his good trip. We heard the screaming get further and further over 2 hours. By this time it was 11 p.m, and the moon was starting to come out, and it was below 30 Fahrenheit. Ty had no jacket nor flashlight, according to Gary. My buddy and I were way too drunk to drive out of camp to get cell service, as it was snowy and icy, and required 2 to 3 miles of highway driving after getting off the trail. And Gary was still lightly feeling the effects of weed and mushrooms, so he couldn't drive. We had to make the decision to let the guy wander, hope he sobered up and could find his way back. And he did. Oh, he did. Right into our camp. We hear yelling after about an hour of no screams, maybe 30 to 50 feet from camp again. "Hey, help, I'm lost. Help me please, I'm lost." And we can tell the man's walking from the woods into our camp. We tell Gary to hide just in case and greet the man with me carrying my 12-gauge shotgun and my 4.0 caliber pistol holstered. My buddy carrying his AK-47 style rifle and his 2 9mm Glocks holstered, and with our flashlights on the brightest setting at his face. He was about 6'3" and about 300 pounds. We talked to him, decided he was calm enough to walk with, and walked him back to his camp. He seemed really remorseful, said he blacked out and didn't remember anything, and he had a falling out with his buddy. We escorted him back to his camp down the trail, returned and told Gary that Ty seemed cool, and if anything else happened to scream and come running, we would come out and help him. It ended up being a happy ending. We made friends with Gary, and I got his phone number to make sure the next day he got back into town safely, back to his wife and kid, and we're actually planning a camping trip with him soon. But Ty, who wandered screaming like a deranged maniac into the forest, potentially wielding a hatchet to murder your friend, to steal his good trip or whatever your psychosis-filled mind was thinking, for the love of God, let's never meet again. It was early spring of 2016. I had turned 24. My friend and I just reached our main spot to camp, Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, just outside of Payson, Arizona. We'd usually travel out here 2 or 3 times a year. It has some incredible views and is only a few hours from the city. For the most part, the area was pretty secluded. A privately owned convenience store rested a few miles away, with a small town 20 miles before that. The entrance was on a dirt road directly off the highway, with a campground sign at the start of the road marking local wildlife, any fire hazards, and general news relevant to camping folk. The paving is mostly linear, with maybe one fork spanning several miles. We once traveled down the dirt road to see how far it would take us. One of the paths would take you to another highway entrance, with a ranger's tower halfway there. The other path led to a dead end. An abandoned cabin can be found on this path, a few miles in, hidden mostly off in the distance behind some larger foliage. The snow had mostly cleared up at this point, leaving for crisp air, a slight chill, and fauna becoming active again. We'd usually spot some wild horses, several deer, and tons of little critters whenever we'd come out this way. It really was the perfect time of year for a relaxing trip to get away from the city for a few days. We got in at around 4 p.m. on Tuesday. It was late for us, as we'd usually try to make it out of there by noon at latest. This trip was pretty spontaneous. We both had work during the coming weekend and decided to just go for it. The sun was setting fast, and we still hadn't picked out our spot to camp. There were maybe 2 other groups, both families parked somewhat near the entrance, only a few hundred yards away from the highway. This time around, we wanted to get far away from humans for a while. Customer service jobs will do that to you. We drove down the dirt road, past our usual spot, and finally picked a perfect area. A small clearing just hanging off the edge of a hill. The whole valley could be seen from this area, with a beautiful sunset. This would have been our main spot from then on, if the next night's incident never happened. We agreed to get a campfire going, and would just avoid building a tent this trip. We didn't have much time to do that, so anyway, and her car wasn't that uncomfortable. I'd sleep in the back seat and she'd take the passenger seat, with the window slightly ajar. We have a few blankets for each of us and would fall into that unrivaled slumber. The next day went fairly uneventful. We got decompressed, and I had this strange feeling throughout the day that we were being watched. There was the crunching of leaves just out of the line of sight every few hours, but I figured it must have just been the local wildlife doing their thing. My friend, as usual, was oblivious to this and didn't notice, so I chose not to dwell on it. When night came, the feeling hadn't dissipated. My friend must have felt something too, though. Though she didn't vocalize it, she took some of her sleeping pills. She didn't usually need to take them on our camping trips. The natural ambience was enough to put anyone to sleep, I thought. As it was nearing 1 a.m., my friend dozed off in the passenger seat, while I attempted to wind down in the back. I leaned against the side window behind the passenger seat, legs outstretched to the car's back door. The window opposite of me was rolled down slightly, with a cold breeze flowing in. I'd been on my phone, scrolling through Facebook or whatever, when I heard something outside. A few crunches of the fallen leaves, several paces outside my car. I whispered to my friend, "Do you hear that?" But she was already out. I put my phone down and listened intently for a minute or two, but there was nothing. It must have been a small animal. Curious. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media. 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again. A crunch right outside the door. I lowered my phone. My eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the phone into the deep darkness of the woods. I let it take control. As I turned the phone away from me, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. And to this day, I cannot get this image out of my head. 2 dirty, scabbed hands held onto the window. The fingers were wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkempt, and dark. Behind the window, a silhouette of a face was pressed up against it. The breath would create condensation every few seconds. All I could make out were the reflections of those empty black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like eternity. The staring contest between me and this thing. My thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they ran away when they saw me? What were they doing? Is this the face of death? After 10 seconds, the hand slowly unclenched from the window and receded into the perpetual darkness. The condensation on the window dispersed, and another few seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunch, 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 melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What the hell happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her up from her slumber into a dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the back door and took a moment to scan the area. Whoever they were, whatever it was gone. I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside and just crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder, listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of the horror that happened. 2 handprints imprinted on the window. I wiped them off in a panic, a reaction to try and erase the event, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored it out of there. My friend finally coming to me, asking me what the hell I'm doing. "We gotta go," I said. "There's someone out there." I didn't see whatever or whoever it was fleeing the scene. Speeding down the dirt road, my friend insisted I slow down. I eventually did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached a Denny's, where my friend asked me to stop and eat at and explain everything. The nightmares subsided a few months later. My embarrassment continues to this day, for the state of shock I was in at the time. Everybody says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm confused whether I have either. I mean, I just sat there and did nothing. I frequently tend to ask myself, who was out there? Another camper messing with us? A resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road? Or perhaps something more paranormal, residing in the forest, watching lone and vulnerable campers as they drift off to sleep. We'd still go camping there in the years ahead, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope it was the last I saw of it. I was camping miles southwest of Jack's alone, and had everything that I needed. I explored the surrounding woods and eventually made a campfire. A few hours go by. Around the fire, I'm scrolling through my phone when I suddenly get a weird feeling. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, so I just chalked it up as paranoia and decided it was time for me to call it a night. I have a habit of tying up my tent zippers for whatever reason, just in case someone or something does find my camp and attempts to empty my tent. After falling asleep, I eventually woke up to my zipper being fiddled with, of course. However, not knowing that the zippers are tied together, and I always carried a pistol no matter where I went, I'd quietly grab it and lay in silence. With my ears straining, I hear the slightest footsteps around my camp and see a faint shadow pass by the barely lit fire that was still glowing. I have a lot more courage than most people, so I untie the zippers, but in silence. I knew that unzipping would alert them that I was awake, so I waited. After a while of hearing nothing, and as slow as possible, I unzip the tent just enough so that I can peek out. When I look out, all my hair stood on end, because I could see 2 men at the edge of my campsite in the faint glow. I couldn't tell the direction they were looking, so I continued to wait to see what they were doing. One walked out of sight to the side or behind my tent, and I slowly cocked my S&W 40 cal as quietly as possible. I'm doing this and I'm certain they didn't hear it. The other guy out of sight whispers and the other one starts to tiptoe relatively quickly towards my tent. I knew I had to do something but was worried because I knew I may be surrounded. So I unzip it fast and blast my pistol right at the guy who was tiptoeing, making him drop to his knees while barely visible. I turn around to see the other guy, but it's completely dark and I hear nothing. I stood there for a moment contemplating while the other guy was groaning. Out of the darkness, the guy comes flying at me with a machete and slashes not an inch from my pistol. I shot the man in his face and knew he must have been dead by how he fell. The other guy, I noticed in the movement, wasn't groaning anymore, and I turned around and he tackled me and stabbed me twice in the upper right-hand side of my torso. Note that I'm a former grappling champion, and with the adrenaline pumping, I am on top of him in less than a second and pounding him in the face like a savage animal until he stops moving. I get up and contemplate shooting him, but won't shoot an unconscious man, so I ran to my car, get in and grab my flashlight as I'm in a panic. I'm not sure if more are around, and I point the flashlight in the direction and no one's there. I was stunned. After looking all around, I stupidly, or not get halfway out of the car, heavily confused because I was sure that I just killed a man and the other was at least unconscious. I get back and grab a towel to wrap it tight around my shoulder to control the bleeding as much as I can before the pain really sets in. After a minute of taking care of the bleeding, I get out and slowly walk back in the direction of my tent, looking in all directions in fear that I would be attacked from any direction. I walked to the location that I shot the man and beat the other, which was only a few feet apart, but there was no blood, no footprints, no sound, no nothing. Of course, my mind is racing 1,000 miles an hour, knowing that I shot a man and knocked another one unconscious. How could they be gone? Terrified, not knowing what was going on, if others were there and they just took them away, I shot my pistol into the woods a few times and ran back to my car and started driving out of the woods, leaving my stuff in the middle of the night. But thinking to myself that it couldn't have been a ghost by how I was injured, and how I saw one fall and scars on my hand from hitting the other, and thinking if they were humans, they would have certainly still been on the ground, or at least blood, scaring myself half to death. When I was about a mile away from the woods with my windows partially down, I heard a loud laughter of multiple men, which made no sense. Terrified, I floored it even more. To this day it scares me, but I have no clue what I encountered that night, or how they just disappeared. The scars leave a reminder for me that that night, it wasn't my imagination. One thing that haunts and confuses me is that I remember seeing no detail on their faces at all, just blackness. When I was camping with my family as a kid, I had a few experiences. The first was when I was heading to the river with my dad to brush my teeth, and my dog was really jumpy and nervous for some reason. Looking around and staring at the ground, I wasn't sure until we were walking back. Did we finally see what she was trying to warn us about? A long-ass, bluish-grey water snake leapt at me as my dad snatched me away and carried me the rest of the way back to our tents. I was 5. The second when I was near 10. I was camping with a friend with both our families and we decided to do some exploring around these giant rocks. After a while of wandering away from our chatting parents and our tents, they let us wander off as long as we were together, the buddy system. We could vaguely hear the sound of running water. We were excited to run down the pebbly hill to the river and maybe splash around a bit. That was until we heard a low, gruff, rumbling noise that sounded aggressively agitated, and it was coming from the same direction as the river. I had a bad feeling, and so did my friend. We didn't know what it was, but we turned tail and ran back to camp. Later on, we found out it was a bear after our neighboring campers had their tents attacked and food stash raided. The tracks led right back to the river in the exact same area of the river that we heard the sound coming from. Moral of the story? Be safe around rivers. This happened a number of years ago. I was camping with a group in a remote area when all of a sudden, to our astonishment, a van pulled up. 2 men got out. They lingered and loitered in the area and made several attempts to contact us. They were wide-eyed and unkempt, shouting loudly amongst themselves in the outhouse, banging and pounding on the walls. It was quite unnerving. They were definitely up to no good. The 5 of us young men all picked up axes and large sticks and made it obvious that we were not easy targets. I think they got the message, because after several hours of loitering and making us feel uncomfortable, they left. but we kept watch throughout the night. Humans are the most dangerous game. I've spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over it, but I must admit North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there and hike and camp. This time, I went with my family in a recreational vehicle and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountains trailhead, as I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't do without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous, not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I had light. So I stopped about half a mile short of the summit, and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I was having trouble sleeping, and usually lay awake for up to an hour in an attempt to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull out my big old knife from my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning I woke up and ate oatmeal. I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with a green cord propped against my tent. Internally, I was pissing myself. I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes, and no way I bothered to go to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and found the trail again, one of the biggest reliefs, and I made it out with no other incident. However, I come to find out that same morning a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible I would have run into him had I had not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him, but I will see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. The circumstances surrounding the guy's death are strange. You can find articles about him. He supposedly fell trying to climb out of a ravine, but was away from his backpack, and had called 911 but didn't get to speak to anyone on the line. This happened in the woods in a park in Colorado. My family was out there with some family friends. They had a camper, and we had a big ray tent. It was a biggish site with a couple of large trails that came through it to the road, though it's important to note that there weren't any campers in any of the sites within a few miles of us. We set up in a little alcove in the bushes on one side, and the camper van was parked on the other, so anyone walking those trails would be between us. We spent the day riding dirt bikes and all heading back to our respective sleeping areas, but I, as usual, had a hard time sleeping. At around 2 a.m., according to my phone, I looked out the slightly see-through mesh of the tent site and saw a single branch or something akin across the trail from me. I spent a long time trying to figure out what it was, and the light never moved, and the next thing I know for sure happened. Footsteps. Slow, ponderous footsteps that made the gravel crunch, walking around the perimeter of our tent, repeatedly. I figured it was just an inquisitive animal whose favorite spot we had taken, but it grew unnerving as the steps continued. The branch out my little window was still lit up. I started to drift asleep lightly, but was awoken when I noticed the steps had stopped and the branch was no longer visible. But something worse happened. A few feet outside my mesh window, I could see, just barely, a crouch, motionless figure. Its outline reminded me of one of the heretics from Outlast 2, a nude figure with branches around its head. I couldn't tell which way it was facing, as my night vision has never been the greatest, but I could see it. My memory gets a bit shaky here, but at some point the figure was gone, and I was able to see the branch again. It was starting to resemble a crucifix to me. Then I fell asleep. The next morning all seemed normal. The first thing I did was look around the tent for footsteps, but all there was gravel and packed dirt, so no luck. Eventually, though, over breakfast, we discussed what everyone else had apparently seen later in the morning, around 2:30 a.m.-ish after I fell asleep. A single person walking from the trail through camp with a flashlight. It wasn't any of us. We decided ultimately it was just someone who liked to walk in the dark. But it still makes my skin crawl. Any ideas on what it could have been? This happened a good 10 years ago now. Right after my friends and I graduated college and realized how much debt we were in for, we wanted to do something fun, all of us together, before we parted ways. We decided the best thing to do would be a camping trip out in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like a great idea on paper, and after making our way there, a 4-hour drive and a 2-hour hike to where we were going to camp, we started to have a really good time. We'd brought ample food and snacks. This wasn't Bear County, and we were just having a really awesome time. That night, we went to sleep, but for some reason, one of my friends was acting up. It just so happened that we were sharing tents, and I asked him what was on his mind. He proceeded to tell me that for the whole time he'd been there, he'd had this strange sensation of being watched, and it was getting very uncomfortable. Now, this friend is usually the life of the party. He will show up somewhere, and everything will get 10 times more fun. But it was a bit of a buzzkill to see him so down in the dumps, so negative. We really weren't sure what to do. I told him to just get into his sleeping bag, and that tomorrow will have a much more fun-filled day, with hikes and the like. He rolled over, just said fine, and I left it at that. I'm a pretty deep sleeper and passed out pretty quickly, but was woken up sharply by my friend pushing my shoulders. "What is it, dude? I'm trying to sleep," I say. He goes, "Shh, someone's here." I groggily open my eyes and ask him what the hell's going on. He tells me that he thinks that we've been followed, and that there's someone around here stalking our camp. I tell him it's nonsense. When we parked, we were the only vehicle there, not to mention the hike was in daytime, so there's no way we'd have missed someone if they were there. He just tells me to wake up and come with him. So I groggily get out of my sleeping bag and see the embers of the fire. All of our friends are still asleep in their sleeping bags, and he passes me a flashlight, but has it off and tells me to wait. We sit there in the silence, listening to the sounds of nature. I was already quite tired and annoyed, so after hearing nothing for X many minutes, I get to the point where I decide that I've had enough and I'm going to go back to my sleeping bag. I gently touch him on the shoulder to let him know that, but without missing a beat, I hear something rustling in one of the bushes nearby. I wait for a moment and tell myself surely it must be a wild animal. There are nocturnal animals in the woods after all. We both wait in silence still. He says, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, dude, it's probably just a deer or something, I don't know." No. Couldn't be. He never explained how he knew it couldn't be. But that's when my desperation got the better of me. I was tired, pissed, and didn't believe someone would be following us. It didn't sound like boots anyway. I say out loud, "This is bull, man." Turn my flashlight on in the direction of the sound, and am greeted with a sight I don't think I'll ever forget. Standing there, near a tree, is a tall, emaciated figure. I'm not even sure where to begin or how to describe it. It was covered in patchy fur. It sort of looked like a bear with mange, but that it had been disfigured as well, standing on its hind legs and glaring at us with this evil glare. I flashed my flashlight on it for about 1 second or 2 tops before we heard it sprint away into the darkness. As you can imagine, after seeing something like that, my friend and I both screamed and naturally started running, but we realized we weren't running anywhere we knew, so quickly added logs to the fire and just sat there, huddled in the dark, and I'm not ashamed to say holding hands, and just waiting to see if that thing would return. Our flashlights depleted their entire battery over the course of the next hour or so, because we were very vigilant and constantly checking our line of sight to see if whatever it was returned. Thankfully it didn't. We spent the night on vigil. And when all our friends woke up, happy and oblivious to the horrors that we had witnessed, we decided it'd be best not to tell them. We had planned to carry on a few more days, and my friend and I tried our best to keep on a merry face and pretend like everything was good, but the rest of our friends could tell there was something up, but didn't push the issue when we just said we had nightmares and couldn't sleep, which I knew they didn't buy. In any case, we never returned camping in the woods, and I don't think I ever will again. I was camping with some friends on one of their family's property that bordered a national forest. Our tents were just inside the cleared part of the property, facing the house and a barn, and another outbuilding. Behind us was uncleared land that after a distance met the boundary of the national forest. I was sharing a tent with my then boyfriend and a friend of his. I was at the back of the tent next to a mesh window. We had all the flaps open for airflow through the mesh windows because it was warm, and I woke up feeling like something was moving around the campsite. I couldn't hear anyone up and about, but saw movement back in the uncleared land behind the campsite. A completely dark human-shaped figure was leaning out from behind a tree, then slowly moving back behind it. It did this a few times, and I woke my boyfriend up to see if he saw it also. He didn't, but said he saw something run deeper into the forest. He switched places with me, and we went back to sleep. His friend never woke up. He says what he saw was definitely upright, not a deer or something like that. We were about 2 miles from a public hiking trail and 4 miles from a public campground. There were other houses on the same road bordering the forest, but located pretty far apart. Don't know who or what we saw, but it was creepy. No one should have been out there. It was definitely on our friend's family land. Last year in the late summer, 2 friends and myself went camping in British Columbia in a pretty populated campsite that was supposed to be super chill in the evening. We had some cooked food and were sharing a bottle of wine and stayed up late chatting. The time was about 1 a.m. We were probably the only people awake, and everything was silent around us, when all of a sudden we hear this thumping running sound towards us, and this feeling of dread sunk into our bones. I have never been more afraid in my life. What was funny was at first we thought it was a man. It must have been huge as the ground itself shook. It was pitch black, and we had lights on around us, so we couldn't see much beyond our area. Whatever it was charged at us at full speed, and we heard a huge crash in the river beside our sight. We ran and hid in the car and assumed it was a bear. Even now when we talk about it, we're still not completely sure, as nothing can begin to describe the feeling of terror we each just felt before we heard the footsteps. To this day, it was the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. This story took place about a year ago. 3 of my friends and I decided to go camp in the middle of the night. I know it's super random, but with all that was going on in the world, we wanted to just be in nature. And we made our super solid plan with a huge hype in under an hour, and jumped into our car and drove outside of the city. We drove to a small town out of the city and left our car there since the woods or place that we can camp was not suited for driving. It was really fun. We're city boys carrying tents, knives, bags, food, etc. And it felt really fun, and no one was scared or cautious, even though we were walking in the middle of the night and far from civilization with the help of our smartphone flashlights. After some hours, we found a place which seemed really cool. Quite a small lake with a huge open area. We settled and put out our tents. The 4 of us served in the army. We all had survival training, so we were pretty calm, and we were not thinking about anything that could go wrong. After finding our spot, me and one friend went away to do the recon of the area and gathered sticks and wood to light a fire. As we're just chilling next to our fire, chatting and relaxing, joking about how unlucky we are as a generation, the time passed. Around 5 a.m. we decided to get into our tents to sleep so that we could wake up around 11 or something, and still can use more daylight and do stuff. After 5 minutes, we get into our tent when we hear a cat meowing like she's in trouble. Me and my wife have 2 cats of our own, and I grew up in a house that was full of these furry friends, so I understand that a cat outside might be in trouble or hungry. We just all look at each other, and we're a bit surprised about how a cat could survive in the woods in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it can. Me growing up in a city wasn't entirely sure. But we got out of the tent to check where she was when we saw this black cat. Again, neither of us are religious nor superstitious, but we started to feel a bit weird, like, dude, it's a black cat. I had some sausages in my bag, so I got one out for her, and after a minute of pss 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 and throwing food in her direction, she suddenly vanished. Again, I was thinking that it's because of the woods and it's dark, so she can disappear. I didn't think it was creepy, and went back to the tent to sleep. After 10 or 15 minutes, one of my friends told us that there was something outside the tent. At first, we thought that it was some wild dogs or our neighbor's black cat. We opened the zipper of our tent just a bit to see what it was, and it was a huge wild boar. It seems pretty normal, right? We are in the woods after all. But something wasn't right about it. And for those of you who don't know, these boars are very dangerous, strong, fast, really tough hide. So, you better shoot them in the right place or they probably won't go down. I was sitting there, really scared and whispering with my buddies like, what the hell are we going to do if it decides to ram or tear our tent? When we hear the cat meow again. Suddenly, everyone had a reaction. Like, what the hell are both those animals just doing there, moving at almost 1 meter close to our tent like they knew each other? It felt so strange, and telling my friends like, why the hell that thing doesn't do anything to the cat, and how is it comfortable meowing and going close to it? I don't know, maybe someone can explain this to me in some rational way, but for me, our night was so scary and weird, and I'm still in shock of that. For about an hour, without attacking us, both of them made circles around our tent, and it scared us. I don't know if it was something paranormal or animalistic, but we were very weirded out. With the sudden disappearance of the cat and then the reappearance, with the huge wild boar in between. Made all of us scared. Does anyone know why they did that? Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you are enjoying tonight's video, that you enjoyed it. Sorry, it's over, isn't it? If of course you did, you can let me know in the comments and stuff like that. I really appreciate it. Remember that likes and comments go a hell of a long way, and it really means a lot to get them. I try and read each and every one, so thank you. A huge thank you as well to my supporters, members and patrons. If you'd like to donate a tiny amount of money every month, like $1 or something, that'd be great to help keep the channel running. It really does mean a lot, so thank you to everyone who does and to anyone who is thinking about doing it. But yes, I think we're going to wrap things up here. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Maybe it'll be cryptids. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.